I'm Jason Schwartz. I'm a managing principal at Blue Vista Capital Management. We're a real estate investment management firm based in Chicago. We've invested in over $10 billion of real estate over the last 18 years. And of that 10 billion of real estate, about 3 billion has been invested into the student housing sector. Within student housing, we are a vertically integrated owner, operator, manager, developer, and fiduciary for institutional capital in student housing. Yeah, there are a number of things that make student housing really attractive as an asset class. I think taking a step back, it's really one of the only alternative real estate asset classes that didn't exist 20 years ago. We've really seen the asset class grow up right in front of our eyes. We raised the first single asset real estate private equity fund in student housing in the US in the mid 2000s, and we've been at the forefront of the sector ever since. I think what makes student housing so compelling is the recession resilience of the sector and the relatively high barriers to entry to be a successful operator. And when I say recession resilience, what I really mean is first, enrollment has actually increased in every recession since the 1950s. So from that perspective, enrollment at US universities is somewhat negatively correlated to US GDP. And so it provides a nice hedge against the US economy. But I think what the real driver is the inelastic demand that students have to live in high quality housing adjacent to the large universities where they go to school. It's a rite of passage for kids to go away to school when they're 18 in the US, and probably a rite of passage for parents to get a little break from their kids as well. And it's that dynamic living, learning environment that exists on college campuses that make it such an irreplaceable experience. And one of the reasons why online learning can never really ever replace the experience of going away to school. Yeah, I'd say looking back in March of 2020, all real estate owners were worried about what comes next. You know, were people going back to work? Were people going to pay their rent? What was going to happen in the United States? We were in the middle of a global pandemic, something that we hadn't experienced in 100 years or more. Looking back 12 months, now looking backwards, I would say that student housing has really performed much better during the global pandemic than most other real estate asset classes where we own real estate. And we're really invested across the board. In total, we ended up as an industry only 3 to 5% behind the prior year's occupancy. Rent collections were over 98%. And even with schools closed, we still managed to lease up. Kids still went back to school. Now, we did see some negative implications of the pandemic, specifically as it related to international enrollment. There was a significant decline in international enrollment in 2020. And the reason for that was twofold. One, there were travel restrictions between countries, and two, international visas were much difficult to get to the US. But that being said, we saw that decline in international enrollment mitigated by two factors. For the first time ever, freshmen were allowed to live off campus. Many schools have a requirement that as a freshman, you have to live in dorms. Well, many universities chose to de-densify their dorms during the pandemic, and as a result needed somewhere else to put their freshmen, and purpose-built student housing really fit the bill. And I'd say secondly, upperclassmen didn't go abroad. So you had a whole swath of upperclassmen that otherwise would be traveling abroad and not signing a 12-month lease that otherwise chose to stay in school on campus. And I'd say lastly, most of the schools where we own properties have already announced plans to go back in person on a more normalized schedule for fall 2021 classes. This is a very important announcement by schools, and as a result, we've seen a significant uptick in pre-leasing for the next academic year as a result of the signals that schools are sending that school is going to be back in session. You should sign a lease and prepare for fall 2021. There's some trends, some development trends, some operational trends, and maybe some investment trends that I think are all kind of coming out of the pandemic. I'd say as for design, student housing residential units were already really well positioned to confront the pandemic because most of our properties have bed bath parity, which means that every resident has their own bedroom, their own bathroom, their own door that they can lock so they can isolate, contain and have their own privacy. So from that perspective, purpose-built student housing was a bit ahead of the curve. Some of the development changes maybe that we're making, I'd say in the amenity areas, there's probably a greater emphasis on furniture distancing, demising larger group spaces into smaller group spaces, touchless entry, air filtration, and more scientific things like antimicrobial coatings for high-touch services. So some of that stuff I think is probably here to stay. From an operational perspective, we had to learn to do things a bit differently. We had to learn how to operate remotely if needed. Never had to do that before. We needed to be able to operate on a short staff, maybe with A and B teams, so that not everybody was working kind of at the same time. And I would say in general, there's just been a much higher focus on sanitation and cleaning. Now, our properties were always clean. I would just say now they're extra clean, and that we're spending a lot more time cleaning the gyms every hour rather than every 6 hours as a result of the pandemic, and a hyper focus and a vigilant focus on cleanliness. And I'd say lastly, on the operational front, we were early to the game as it relates to virtual tours and just online leasing, but that has really become the norm. And so we're seeing a higher and higher percentage of students choosing to sign leases online, many of whom have never actually seen the property in person. So being set up technologically and organizationally to support that sort of technological change, I think was really important to our success last year as well. I think as is the case with any asset class, there are myths versus reality. And I think in student housing, there are a few myths about the industry that don't really correlate to the reality, at least that we see on a daily basis. I'd say the first one that we hear about a bit is that student housing as an industry has been oversupplied versus demand. And as if you think about it, because the industry didn't exist 20 years ago, what you've seen is a significant amount of development that's occurred over the last 20 years. But today, purpose-built student housing only accounts for just under 20% of the total housing stock at universities across the US. So from that perspective, I think the construction of purpose-built student housing has really been in direct response to student demand for higher quality housing. And despite the recent construction activity, most students actually still live in substandard non-purpose-built product, as evidenced by the fact that student housing, purpose-built student housing, is less than 20% of the total. And despite the fact that over the last 10 years, for example, 50,000 beds have been added a year, so that's 500,000 new beds that have been added over the last decade, the industry has maintained a 95% industry occupancy, which I think really points to the fact that you have a combination of enrollment growth and also a changing in tastes of today's student that are more focused on the amenities that are offered, the safety that's offered, and the bed bath parity that's typically offered in purpose-built student housing. I'd say another one, I just hit on enrollment. There are some periodicals that talk about declining in enrollment for US universities. And I think when you think about enrollment and national enrollment, you really have to bifurcate it between enrollment at four-year public and private nonprofit universities, which are the main targets for investment for us and for many like us in the sector, versus two-year vocational schools or for-profit education. And what I'd say is that four-year public and private nonprofit universities have maintained consistent growth, whereas enrollment for for-profit institutions have declined by almost 50% since 2010. So when you look at national enrollment as a whole, it may look like enrollment's declining, but it's not declining where we invest. And the schools of first choice, the tier one schools where we tend to focus, have consistent long-term growth historically and projected going forward. And I would say one more myth maybe about the sector is there are concerns about affordability. I mean, tuition has increased every year that I've been around, and has significantly outpaced inflation since the 1980s. So I think there's a concern that maybe going to school and paying for housing is becoming too burdensome for students today. And the way I think about that is I look at the average debt of students coming out of school. The average debt for someone graduating from a four-year public or private nonprofit university was under $30,000 in 2019. And 77% of all borrowers owed less than $40,000. 30% graduated with no debt, and only 6% graduated with more than $100,000 of debt. And most of those were graduate or doctorate students that projected to earn significantly more income after graduation. Blue Vista's outlook on the sector, I'd say that looking into 2021 and beyond, we remain quite bullish on the student housing sector. We've already seen significant signs of recovery coming out of the pandemic, and we expect it to pick up further this spring and summer as more schools announce their plans to be open in the fall. We think there's going to be a continuing trend to a flight to quality. Top tier universities and locations from both an operational and an investment perspective will remain very much in vogue. Schools of first choice are well positioned to succeed, I think, for now and into the future. And we are really looking to invest in schools that will be the net aggregators, the schools of first choice. And the factors that we look at are one, for example, applications were up big this year. The common application was up over 10%, and applications to Ivy League schools were soaring. Harvard applications were up over 40% this year. So when you think about the demand coming back, you think about the flight to quality, and then from an investment perspective, I think you look at the sector and you say, on the whole, when comparing against other real estate asset classes, the student housing sector is still very attractive, and it's attracting a lot of domestic and global interest as a result. I think another factor that you'll probably see is significantly less development over the next 2 to 3 years as a result of COVID. We project 20 to 25% decline in new beds added during that period of time, which will also help improve the fundamentals for the existing properties that exist today.